Nothing cuts deeper than the silence of children who've forgotten your name. For 63-year-old Jedediah Stroud, that silence followed him all the way to the Colorado Territory, where he went to disappear among the peaks. He had nothing left. No letters, no visits, just the echo of empty rooms where laughter used to live. But in those remote mountains, Jed found a dying wolf caught in a trap near a falling-down cabin. He freed the animal, and somehow they saved each other. What started as two broken souls just trying to survive became something beautiful. They fixed up that old cabin together, built a garden, made it into a real home. The locals started calling it Paradise Ridge. But what would happen when word got out about what the abandoned father had built in the wilderness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Paradise Ridge like a gentle shroud, wrapping around the hand-hewn logs of what had once been nothing more than a rotting shell. Jedediah Stroud stood on his porch, coffee steaming in a tin cup that had seen better decades, watching the sun paint the distant peaks in shades of gold and amber. Beside him, a massive grey wolf named Ghost stretched and yawned, revealing teeth that could crush bone, but had never once been turned against the old man who'd saved his life. 3 years had passed since that spring morning, when Jed had found Ghost bleeding and near death in a rusted steel trap. 3 years since two broken souls had stumbled into each other's lives and somehow stitched themselves back together with nothing but time, sweat, and the kind of understanding that comes without words. The cabin bore no resemblance to the crumbling wreck it had been, where rotted logs had once let in wind and rain. Now solid timber formed walls that held back the mountain cold. The roof, once more holes than shingles, now shed water like it was meant to, thanks to hand-split cedar that Jed had cut and shaped himself. Windows that had been nothing but empty frames now held glass, precious glass that had cost him 2 weeks' worth of pelts traded down in Millfield. The nearest settlement 30 miles through treacherous mountain passes, but it wasn't just the practical improvements that made this place special. Jed had built beauty into every corner, the way a man builds prayers into a church. The porch stretched across the entire front of the cabin, supported by posts he'd carved with simple patterns that caught the light just so. Wildflowers grew in carefully tended beds along the foundation, lupines and Indian paintbrush, columbines and mountain asters that turned the approach to the cabin into a riot of color come summer. Behind the cabin, terraced gardens carved from the mountainside produced more vegetables than one man and one wolf could eat. Potatoes and turnips, carrots and onions, beans that climbed poles made from lodgepole pine. A small orchard of apple trees, barely more than saplings when he'd planted them, now showed the promise of fruit in years to come. Everything planned, everything tended, everything built to last. Ghost padded to the edge of the porch and looked out over their domain with the satisfied air of a king surveying his kingdom. The wolf had grown sleek and powerful under Jed's care, his grey coat thick and lustrous, his yellow eyes alert and intelligent. Where once he'd been nothing but ribs and matted fur, now he moved with the fluid grace of his wild ancestors. And though something in his bearing showed he'd chosen domesticity over the call of the pack, Jed sipped his coffee and let his mind wander back to the letters that no longer came. 3 children he'd raised from babies, Sarah, Michael, and Thomas, each one a piece of his heart, walking around in the world. Sarah, his eldest, had been the practical one, always organizing her younger brothers, always making sure everyone did their chores. She'd married a banker in Philadelphia and moved into a fine house with servants and carriages. Her last letter, now over 4 years old, had been stiff and formal, full of polite inquiries about his health, but empty of warmth. Michael had inherited his father's hands for building, but turned them toward the new industrial world instead of honest carpentry. He'd taken work in a steel mill in Pittsburgh, risen through the ranks until he owned a piece of the operation. His letters had stopped coming when Jed refused his son's offer to move east and live in a boarding house near the mill. "Come where there's civilization, Pa," Michael had written. "This mountain nonsense ain't fitting for a man your age." Thomas, the youngest and most like his father in temperament, had surprised everyone by taking up the law. He'd moved to Denver, hung out his shingle, and built a practice representing mining companies and railroad interests. His final letter had come with legal papers, documents that would transfer ownership of the family land back east to his brothers and sister. "Since you clearly have no intention of returning to claim it yourself," none of them had visited. None had written in over 3 years. It was as if Jedediah Stroud had simply faded from their lives like morning mist, leaving no trace that he'd ever been their father at all. The pain of their abandonment had driven him to these mountains, seeking solitude and an end to the constant ache of waiting for letters that never came. He'd sold what little he owned back in Pennsylvania, packed his few belongings, and headed west with no destination in mind except somewhere far from memories. The Colorado Territory had called to him with its promise of vast spaces and anonymity. He'd found this cabin by accident, following an old Indian trail that seemed to lead nowhere. The structure had been built by some long-dead trapper or prospector, someone who'd had the sense to choose a spot with water, shelter from the worst winds, and a view that could heal a broken heart. When Jed first laid eyes on it, the roof had caved in on one side, the door hung by a single hinge, and animals had been using it for shelter for years. But something about the place spoke to him. Maybe it was the way the morning light slanted through the pines to warm the clearing. Maybe it was the sound of the creek that ran year-round, just 50 yards from the front door. Or maybe it was simply that both he and the cabin were broken things that deserved a chance at redemption. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. That first winter had been about survival, patching the roof well enough to keep out snow, chinkling gaps between logs with mud and moss, keeping a fire going in the old stone fireplace that thankfully still drew properly. He'd lived on game meat and whatever supplies he could haul up from Millfield when the passes were clear. Spring had brought Ghost, and with the wolf came purpose beyond mere survival. Watching the animal heal gave Jed something to care for besides himself. Teaching Ghost to trust again taught Jed that trust was still possible even after betrayal. Working together to improve their shared home showed both man and wolf that partnership could exist without expectations or demands. The locals in Millfield had thought him touched in the head at first. "Living with a wolf," they'd mutter when he came to town for supplies. "Man's gone strange up in the mountains." But as the seasons passed and word spread of what he was building, the muttering changed to something approaching respect. Traders and trappers would sometimes make the difficult journey up to Paradise Ridge just to see what the hermit and his wolf had accomplished. Martha Henley, who ran the general store in Millfield, had been the first to use the name that stuck. "That place of yours up on the ridge," she'd said during one of his supply runs. "Folks are calling it Paradise Ridge, you know. Pretty as anything anyone's ever seen in these parts." The name fit. Paradise hadn't been the destination Jed was seeking when he came west, but somehow he'd built it anyway. Not the paradise of biblical promise, but something more practical and real, a place where broken things could be made whole, where silence wasn't empty but full of peace, where the only family that mattered was the one that chose to stay. Ghost's ears perked up, swiveling toward the trail that led down from their ridge. Jed set down his coffee cup and listened, his own ears still sharp despite his years. Hoofbeats on rock, moving slow and careful up the switchbacked path he'd carved into the mountainside. Someone was coming, and from the sound of it, someone who knew enough about mountain travel to take their time. Visitors were rare, but not unknown. Occasionally, a trapper would stop by to trade news for a hot meal and a roof for the night. Sometimes a prospector would ask permission to pan the creek that ran through his land. Once a family heading west had gotten lost and stumbled onto his trail, desperate for food and shelter, but this felt different. The hoofbeats had the measured cadence of someone who knew exactly where they were going, not the hesitant pace of the lost or curious. Ghost's hackles weren't raised, which meant the approaching rider posed no immediate threat. But the wolf's alert posture suggested this wasn't just another casual visitor. Jed moved to the railing of his porch and looked down the trail. Through the trees, he caught glimpses of a horse and rider making their way up the final switchback. The horse was a good one, well fed and well cared for, not the kind of mount a drifter would own. The rider sat easy in the saddle with the confidence of someone accustomed to long journeys. As they rounded the last bend and emerged into the clearing, Jed got his first clear look at his visitor. A woman, maybe 40 years old, dressed in practical traveling clothes but carrying herself with an air of authority that spoke of education and means. Her horse was indeed a fine animal, and her tack was well maintained and expensive. She pulled up at the edge of the clearing and sat for a moment, taking in the sight of Paradise Ridge with obvious appreciation. Her eyes moved from the cabin with its carefully carved porch posts to the flower gardens, from the vegetable terraces to the small orchard, finally settling on the man and wolf watching her from the porch. "Mr. Stroud?" she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the space between them. "Mr. Jedediah Stroud?" The sound of his name, spoken by a stranger in this place he'd thought hidden from the world, sent a chill down Jed's spine. No one knew his full name up here. In Millfield, he was simply the Hermit or the Wolfman. He'd never given anyone his Christian name or surname. "Depends who's asking," he replied, his hand instinctively moving to rest on Ghost's head. The wolf pressed against his leg, a solid reminder that whatever this was, he wouldn't face it alone. The woman dismounted with practiced ease and took a few steps closer, her hands visible and empty, a gesture of peace that Jed appreciated even as his wariness increased. "My name is Catherine Morrison," she said. "I'm an attorney from Denver. I believe we need to talk." The leather satchel Catherine Morrison carried looked official and ominous as she climbed the steps to Jed's porch. Ghost let out a low rumble, not quite a growl, but a sound that made it clear he was watching every move the stranger made. Jed kept his hand on the wolf's head, drawing comfort from the animal's solid presence. "Coffee's still warm," Jed said, gesturing toward the pot on the small table beside his chair. "Mountain hospitality says I should offer, even to lawyers bearing whatever news you've brought." Catherine accepted the invitation with a slight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She took the offered cup with steady hands, but Jed noticed she held it more for warmth than to drink. The morning air was crisp at this elevation, even in late spring. "You've built something remarkable here," she said, looking out over the gardens and the view beyond. "The stories they tell in Denver don't do it justice." "Stories?" Jed's voice carried a note of warning. "What kind of stories?" "About the hermit who lives with wolves. About Paradise Ridge and the man who turned a ruin into something out of a fairy tale." Catherine set down her cup and reached for her satchel. "But that's not why I'm here, Mr. Stroud. I'm here because of your children." The words hit Jed like a physical blow. Ghost sensed the change in his companion and pressed closer, yellow eyes fixed on the woman who'd brought pain with her simple statement. "My children made their feelings clear years ago," Jed said, his voice carefully controlled. "They don't want an old man cluttering up their civilized lives." "Nothing's changed on that account." Catherine pulled a thick envelope from her satchel, the kind of heavy paper that meant legal documents. "I'm afraid something has changed, Mr. Stroud. Your son Thomas is dead." The world seemed to tilt sideways for a moment. Jed gripped the porch railing to steady himself, feeling as though the solid timber might give way beneath his hands. Thomas, his youngest boy, the one who'd been quick with a smile and quicker with questions, who'd followed his father around the workshop like a devoted shadow until the law called him away. When? The word came out as barely a whisper, 3 months ago. A fever took him quickly, too quickly for the doctors to do much good. Catherine's voice carried genuine sympathy now. "I handled his legal affairs. He was successful, Mr. Stroud, very successful. He owned property in Denver, had investments, savings. I don't want his money." The words came out harder than Jed intended. "If that's why you've come all this way, you can head right back down that mountain. It's not about money. Mr. Stroud, it's about what he wanted." Catherine opened the envelope and pulled out several documents. "Thomas wrote a will 2 years ago. In it, he left specific instructions about his estate and about you. Jed stared at the papers without taking them. Legal documents had brought him nothing but pain. The transfer papers that had stripped him of his land back east. The cold, formal letters that had severed his children's ties to him. He wanted no part of whatever these new papers might contain. He remembered this place, Catherine continued. Paradise Ridge. He'd heard stories about what you'd built here, stories that came back to Denver through traders and trappers. He was proud of you, Mr. Stroud. Proud. The word came out bitter as mountain wind. Proud enough to write letters? Proud enough to visit? Proud enough to let his old father know he was even alive? Catherine's composure wavered slightly. He was stubborn, like his father, according to what he told me. He wanted to make the first move toward reconciliation, but he wanted to do it right. He was planning to come here this summer, to see Paradise Ridge for himself, and to apologize. The revelation hit Jed like an avalanche, sudden and overwhelming. Thomas had been planning to visit. His youngest son, the one who'd cut him deepest with those legal papers, had been ready to bridge the gap between them. And now he never would. The fever came quickly, Catherine said softly. He had time to arrange his affairs, but not time to make amends. That's why he included these provisions in his will. Against his better judgment, Jed found himself reaching for the documents. The legal language was dense and formal, but certain phrases jumped out at him. To my father, Jedediah Stroud, in recognition of his courage in building a new life, in hopes that this gesture might begin to heal the wounds caused by my pride and stubbornness. With love and regret for words unspoken, the most stunning revelation came in the final paragraph of Thomas's will. His entire estate, the house in Denver, the investments, the savings from his successful law practice, was to be liquidated and used to purchase the land surrounding Paradise Ridge, not for development or exploitation, but to protect it, to ensure that Jed's sanctuary would remain untouched for as long as he lived. He bought you a kingdom, Catherine said quietly. Nearly 2,000 acres from ridge to ridge, including all the water rights. It's yours, Mr. Stroud, all of it, along with enough money to maintain it and live comfortably for the rest of your days. Jed's hands shook as he held the papers. The legal description encompassed not just the small clearing where he'd built his cabin, but the entire watershed, the mountains he could see from his porch, the valleys where elk came to graze, the high meadows where wildflowers bloomed in summer. Thomas had given him more than land. He'd given him a legacy. But there's a condition, Catherine added, her voice taking on a more formal tone. Sarah and Michael have challenged the will. They claim Thomas wasn't of sound mind when he wrote it, that no reasonable person would leave such wealth to a father who'd abandoned his family to live like a hermit in the wilderness. The papers suddenly felt heavy as stones in Jed's hands. Of course his other children would fight this. Of course they'd find a way to turn even Thomas's final gesture of love into another battlefield. They're claiming you abandoned your family, Catherine continued, that you chose isolation over responsibility, that Thomas was romanticizing a father who'd never been there for his children when they needed him. And what do you think? Jed asked, his voice rough with emotion. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the gardens and the careful improvements that spoke of years of patient work. I think Thomas knew exactly what he was doing. I think he understood that building this place took more courage than most men possess. And I think his brother and sister are more interested in money than in understanding what their father actually accomplished here. Ghost whined softly, sensing the turmoil in his companion. Jed reached down to scratch behind the wolf's ears, drawing comfort from the familiar gesture. The animal had been with him through every season of building Paradise Ridge, had shared every sunrise and sunset from this porch. Ghost understood loyalty in ways that blood relatives apparently did not. What happens now? Jed asked. Now we fight, Catherine said, gathering the papers and returning them to her satchel. We go to court and prove that Thomas was exactly as sound of mind as any man who ever lived. We show them what you've built here and why it deserved protecting. We make them understand that sometimes a man's greatest success isn't measured in money or social standing, but in the courage to start over and build something beautiful from nothing. And if we lose, Catherine's jaw tightened. If we lose, they'll sell this land to whoever offers the highest price. Mining companies, railroad interests, developers who see nothing but profit in these mountains. Paradise Ridge will become a memory, and everything you and Thomas both believed in will be destroyed. The weight of it settled on Jed's shoulders like a physical burden. For 3 years he'd lived in peace, believing his battles were behind him. Now he faced the prospect of fighting for the very ground beneath his feet against his own children. In courtrooms where lawyers passed meanings and judges decided the worth of a man's life. But as he looked out over what he'd built, the gardens, the cabin, the life he'd shared with Ghost, Jed felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not just the old stubbornness that had carried him through hardship, but genuine anger. Thomas had died, trying to heal their family's wounds, and his siblings wanted to tear up that healing and scatter it to the wind. "When does this fight start?" he asked. Catherine smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "It already has, Mr. Stroud. The hearing is set for 6 weeks from today in the Denver courthouse. Are you ready to remind the world that Jedediah Stroud is still very much alive?" Catherine Morrison stayed 3 days at Paradise Ridge, and in that time, Jed learned more about his youngest son's final years than he'd known in all the silent years since their last correspondence. Thomas had built a reputation in Denver as a lawyer who took on difficult cases, particularly those involving land disputes between small settlers and large corporations. He'd made enemies among the railroad barons and mining magnates, but he'd also made enough friends among common folk to build a thriving practice. He never married, Catherine told Jed as they walked through the terraced gardens on her second morning there. Ghost padded alongside them, having decided the lawyer posed no threat to his territory. Said he was too busy building something to worry about sharing it with anyone else. Now I understand what he meant. She gestured toward the mountainside, where Jed had carved growing spaces from seemingly impossible terrain. Each terrace was a marvel of engineering and patience. Retaining walls built from fitted stone, drainage systems that prevented washouts during spring runoff, soil amendments that had taken years to perfect. It was the work of a man who understood that lasting things grew slowly. Thomas kept a photograph on his desk, Catherine continued. A daguerreotype of a man and 3 children standing in front of a half-built house. The man had his sleeves rolled up and sawdust in his hair. The children were maybe 6, 8, and 10 years old, all grinning like they'd just discovered treasure. Jed remembered that photograph. Sarah had insisted on having it taken when they'd finished framing the house back in Pennsylvania. She'd wanted to document the moment when their new home stopped being just foundation stones and started looking like a place where a family might live. Thomas had been so excited he could barely stand still for the long exposure. He told me once that his father had taught him the difference between building something and just putting it together, Catherine said. Building something meant it would last. It meant you cared enough to do it right, even when no one was watching. The words stirred memories Jed had tried to bury. Long summer evenings, teaching Thomas how to choose the right wood for a project, how to read the grain, how to plan each cut so there'd be no waste. The boy had been a quick learner, eager to please, always asking questions that showed he was thinking beyond the immediate task. "What happened to us?" Jed asked, more to himself than to Catherine. "How did we get so far apart that he couldn't just write a letter?" "Pride," Catherine answered simply. "The same pride that drove you to build this place instead of living on your children's charity. The same pride that drove him to succeed in Denver instead of coming back to ask forgiveness for words he wished he'd never spoken." On her final morning, Catherine helped Jed inventory the legal documents they'd need for the court battle ahead. Thomas's will was thorough and carefully written, but Sarah and Michael's challenge had teeth. They'd hired a prominent Denver law firm and were arguing that their father's mountain isolation proved he was unfit to inherit such a substantial estate. "They're painting you as a Man who abandoned his responsibilities, Catherine explained as they sat at Jed's kitchen table, papers spread between them. A father who chose selfishness over family, who ran away instead of dealing with life's challenges. Maybe they're not wrong, Jed said quietly. Ghost, lying by the fireplace, lifted his head at the defeated tone in his companion's voice. Are you serious? Catherine's voice carried a sharp edge. Look around you, Mr. Stroud. Look at what you've accomplished here. Does this look like the work of a man running away from challenges? She gestured toward the windows that framed views of the carefully tended landscape beyond. You didn't run away from responsibility, you redefined it. Instead of becoming a burden to children who'd already moved on with their lives, you built something extraordinary. You proved that starting over isn't giving up. But Catherine's words couldn't entirely ease the doubt that had taken root in Jed's mind. Maybe his children were right. Maybe a real father would have swallowed his pride and knocked on their doors, would have forced reconciliation instead of waiting for letters that never came. Maybe Paradise Ridge was nothing more than an elaborate way of hiding from uncomfortable truths. That evening, after Catherine had ridden back down the mountain with promises to send word about court preparations, Jed sat on his porch watching the stars emerge over the peaks. Ghost settled beside him, the wolf's breathing steady and calm in the mountain quiet. What do you think, old friend? Jed asked, scratching behind the animal's ears. Am I fooling myself about what we've built here? Ghost's response was to shift closer and rest his massive head on Jed's knee, a gesture of trust and companionship that spoke louder than words. The wolf had no doubts about the value of their partnership or the worth of their mountain sanctuary. Over the following weeks, as spring gave way to early summer, Jed found himself looking at Paradise Ridge through different eyes. Were the gardens just an old man's hobby or proof of perseverance? Was the rebuilt cabin a monument to stubbornness or a testament to the possibility of redemption? The questions followed him through his daily routines like persistent shadows. The first crack in his confidence came when he rode down to Millfield for supplies and encountered a stranger at Martha Henley's general store. The man was well-dressed and soft-looking, clearly from back east, and he was asking pointed questions about land ownership in the high country. Understand, there's some dispute about a property called Paradise Ridge, the stranger was saying to Martha when Jed walked in. My clients are interested in acquiring mountain land for development purposes. Martha's eyes found Jed over the stranger's shoulder, and her expression tightened. Mister, Paradise Ridge ain't for sale, and it ain't likely to be any time soon. Everything's for sale at the right price, the stranger replied smoothly. Especially when the current ownership is uncertain. Jed felt anger rise in his chest like floodwater. These vultures were already circling, waiting for the court battle to strip away his legal claim to the land. To them, Paradise Ridge was just another commodity to be bought, developed and exploited. You might want to be more careful about spreading rumors, Jed said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being listened to. Especially when you don't know who might be listening. The stranger turned, took one look at Jed's weathered face and steady eyes, and seemed to shrink slightly. I'm just gathering information about potential opportunities. Then here's some information for you, Martha said, her voice sharp as winter wind. Paradise Ridge belongs to Jedediah Stroud, and it's going to stay that way. Now, if you're not buying supplies, you can take your questions and your opportunities somewhere else. The stranger left quickly, but his presence lingered like smoke. Word was spreading about the court case, about the possibility that Paradise Ridge might change hands. Speculators and developers were already positioning themselves to profit from whatever decision the judge might make. That night, Jed lay awake, listening to the creek that ran past his cabin, thinking about Thomas and the gift his son had tried to give him. Not just the land itself, but the recognition that what he'd built here mattered, that a man's worth couldn't be measured only by conventional success, but also by his courage to create something beautiful in an ugly world. Ghost stirred in his sleep, running in whatever dream occupied a wolf's mind. Jed reached out to touch the animal's fur, drawing comfort from the contact. Whatever happened in that Denver courtroom, he wouldn't go down without a fight. Thomas had believed in Paradise Ridge enough to stake his entire estate on protecting it. The least his father could do was prove that faith wasn't misplaced. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late June, carried up the mountain by young Billy Henley, Martha's grandson, who earned coin running messages between Millfield and the scattered homesteads in the high country. Billy's horse was lathered with sweat from the climb, and the boy himself looked like he'd rather be anywhere else than delivering bad news to the Wolfman. "From that lady lawyer," Billy said, handing over the envelope with hands that shook slightly. At 15, he'd heard all the stories about Jedediah Stroud and his wild companion, and Ghost's steady yellow gaze wasn't doing much to calm his nerves. Jed tipped the boy a silver dollar and watched him ride away before opening Catherine's letter. The news wasn't unexpected, but it still hit like a punch to the gut. Sarah and Michael had hired additional attorneys and were escalating their challenge. They'd filed papers claiming that Thomas had been unduly influenced by romantic stories about their father's mountain life, that no rational person would believe a hermit deserved to inherit such valuable property. Worse, they'd found witnesses willing to testify about Jed's supposed abandonment of his family responsibilities. Former neighbors from Pennsylvania who remembered him leaving suddenly after his wife's death. Business associates who could speak to his failure to maintain contact with his children. Character witnesses who would paint him as a man who chose selfish isolation over family duty. The letter included copies of depositions that made Jed's stomach turn. Sarah described him as emotionally distant and more concerned with his carpentry projects than his children's needs. Michael claimed their father had always preferred solitude to human company and had shown no interest in being part of our adult lives. The words stung because they contained enough truth to cut deep. Catherine's strategy for defending the will was outlined in careful legal language, but it boiled down to proving that Thomas had been of sound mind and that Jed's mountain retreat represented strength rather than weakness. She would need character witnesses of her own, people who could speak to what he'd accomplished at Paradise Ridge and what kind of man he'd become in the wilderness. The problem was that Jed had deliberately cultivated solitude. Apart from occasional interactions with the people of Millfield, he'd avoided forming the kind of relationships that might now serve him in court. He'd built Paradise Ridge as a sanctuary from human complications, and now that very isolation was being used as evidence against him. Ghost sensed his companion's distress and pressed close, offering the wordless comfort that had sustained Jed through 3 years of mountain winters. The wolf's loyalty was absolute and uncomplicated, unlike the tangled emotions that came with blood relations. "What am I going to do, old friend?" Jed asked, scratching behind the animal's ears. "How do I prove to a judge that I'm not the selfish hermit my children think I am?" The answer came from an unexpected source. 2 days after Catherine's letter arrived, Jed heard the sound of multiple horses making their way up his trail. Ghost's ears perked forward, but his posture remained relaxed. Whoever was coming meant no harm. The riders who emerged into his clearing were familiar faces from Millfield and the surrounding settlements. Martha Henley led the group, her weathered face set with determination. Behind her rode Doc Patterson, the traveling physician who served the scattered mountain communities. Pete Mackenzie, who ran a small ranch in the valley below, brought up the rear alongside Father Miguel, the circuit priest who held services in Millfield once a month. "Heard you might be having some legal troubles," Martha said without preamble as she dismounted. "Figured it was time we had a talk." They gathered on Jed's porch, accepting coffee and taking in the view that had drawn admirers from across the territory. Doc Patterson, a man who'd seen his share of human folly and triumph, shook his head in appreciation as he looked out over the terraced gardens. "Never gets old. Seeing what you've accomplished here," he said, "reminds a man that starting over doesn't have to mean giving up." "That's exactly what we came to talk about," Martha added. "Word's gotten around about your children trying to take this place away from you. About them claiming you're some kind of hermit who abandoned his responsibilities. Father Miguel, a small man with kind eyes and calloused hands, leaned forward in his chair. "We've been talking among ourselves, and we think those children of yours don't know the first thing about their father." Pete Mackenzie nodded agreement. "Remember that winter 2 years back when the avalanche cut off the Jameson family? You were the one who broke trail through 10 feet of snow to get Doc here to their place when their youngest got sick. And last summer when the Hendricks lost their cabin to that lightning fire." Doc Patterson added, "You spent 2 weeks helping them rebuild. It wouldn't take a penny for your time or materials. The stories came tumbling out, acts of kindness and community service that Jed had performed without thinking much about them. Times when his carpentry skills had helped repair storm damage. Occasions when his knowledge of mountain survival had guided lost travelers to safety. Moments when Paradise Ridge had served as a beacon of hope for people facing their own struggles with starting over." "You think we didn't notice?" Martha asked, her voice gentle but firm. "You think we couldn't see that you were working through your own pain while you helped others work through theirs?" Father Miguel pulled a well-worn notebook from his coat pocket. "I've been keeping records of the people you've helped over the years. Names, dates, circumstances. Would make for interesting testimony, don't you think?" The offer of support caught Jed off guard. He genuinely believed his mountain neighbors saw him as an eccentric hermit, tolerated but not truly valued. The revelation that they'd been watching, appreciating, and documenting his contributions to their community shifted something fundamental in his understanding of his place in the world. "There's something else," Doc Patterson said, his tone becoming more serious. "That developer who was sniffing around Millfield last week? He wasn't the first. There's been a steady stream of speculators asking about mountain land, particularly properties with water rights and scenic value. They're calling it wilderness development," Pete explained with disgust. "Planning to build fancy resorts for rich folks from back east? Turn our mountains into some kind of playground for people who want to pretend they're roughing it while staying in luxury hotels." Martha's expression hardened. "Paradise Ridge sits right in the middle of the biggest tract they're eyeing. If your children succeed in breaking that will, this place will be sold to the highest bidder within a month of the court decision." The stakes suddenly felt much larger than one old man's claim to a mountain homestead. This was about preserving a way of life, protecting a landscape that had already given so much to the people who understood its value. "Will you let us help?" Father Miguel asked simply. "Will you let us stand up in that Denver courtroom and tell the truth about what kind of man Jedediah Stroud really is?" Jed looked out over Paradise Ridge, seeing it through new eyes. Not just his personal sanctuary, but a symbol of what was possible when people chose courage over comfort. When they built something lasting, instead of just consuming what others had created. "Yes," he said, his voice carrying the strength that had sustained him through 3 years of mountain solitude. "I'll accept your help, and I'll fight for this place like it's worth fighting for." The preparation for the court battle consumed the rest of July and most of August. Catherine Morrison made 3 more trips up to Paradise Ridge, each time bringing new documents to review and strategies to discuss. The case had grown beyond a simple will dispute. It had become a referendum on what constituted a life well lived and whether a man's worth could be measured in conventional terms. During one of these visits, Catherine brought news that made Jed's blood run cold. Sarah and Michael had hired private investigators to dig into their father's past, looking for anything that might support their claim of abandonment and irresponsibility. The investigators had spoken to people in Pennsylvania, had examined records from his wife's death, had even tracked down former customers who might have complaints about his carpentry work. "They're building a case that you've always been unreliable," Catherine explained as they walked through Jed's workshop. A lean-to structure attached to the cabin where he crafted, furniture and tools, with the same meticulous care he'd applied to everything else at Paradise Ridge. They want to show a pattern of choosing personal interests over family, obligations. The workshop told a different story. Hand tools hung in perfect order on walls lined with lumber of various types and sizes. A half-finished rocking chair sat on the main workbench, its curves flowing like water captured in wood. Every surface spoke of patience, skill, and the kind of attention to detail that separated true craftsmanship from mere assembly. "Look at this," Catherine said, running her hand along the smooth arm of the rocking chair. "This isn't the work of an irresponsible man. This is the work of someone who understands that anything worth doing is worth doing right." But Jed knew his children's accusations weren't entirely unfounded. In the months after his wife's death, he had withdrawn from family life. Grief had made him distant, unable to provide the emotional support his children needed. He'd thrown himself into his work as a way of avoiding the emptiness that filled their house, and perhaps his children had interpreted that withdrawal as abandonment. The memories were painful to examine. Sarah, at 16, trying to manage household responsibilities while finishing her schooling. Michael, at 14, struggling with the anger that came with losing a mother too young. Thomas, at 12, the most sensitive of the three, watching his father disappear into his workshop for hours at a time while the family fell apart around them. "I wasn't a good father after their mother died," Jed admitted to Catherine. "Maybe I was running away even then." "Grief affects people differently," Catherine replied. "Some people need to talk through their pain. Others need to work through it. That doesn't make either approach wrong." She picked up a small wooden figure from the workbench, a carved wolf that captured Ghost's essence in a few simple lines. The piece was clearly meant as a gift, probably for one of the children in Millfield who'd overcome their fear of the real wolf enough to appreciate his gentle nature. "Your children judge you based on what they needed from you when they were young," Catherine continued. "But they can't see what you've become, what you've learned, what you've built since then. They're fighting to defeat a man who doesn't exist anymore." The truth of that observation settled into Jed's bones like winter cold. The man who'd retreated into his workshop after his wife's death bore little resemblance to the man who'd built Paradise Ridge with patience and purpose. Grief had taught him about loss, but the mountains had taught him about renewal. As the court date approached, a parade of supporters began making the difficult journey up to Paradise Ridge. Word had spread through the mountain communities about the upcoming legal battle, and people wanted to see for themselves what was at stake. Many of them had their own stories about starting over, about finding new purpose after loss or failure. Elena Vasquez arrived on a warm August morning, her wagon loaded with supplies for the winter months ahead. She'd lost her husband to a mining accident 2 years earlier and had been running their small ranch alone ever since. At 52, she was starting over just as surely as Jed had, and she understood the courage that required. "People think starting over means giving up," she told Jed as they stood looking out over his gardens. "But it takes more strength to build something new than to keep limping along with something that's broken." Her words carried the weight of experience. Elena had faced pressure to sell her ranch and move to town after her husband's death, but she'd chosen to stay and make it work on her own terms. Like Jed, she'd discovered that solitude didn't have to mean loneliness, that independence could be its own form of family. The Jameson family came next. All 6 of them crowded into a wagon that had seen better days. They brought fresh bread and their youngest daughter's drawings, pictures of Paradise Ridge as seen through a child's eyes, full of color and wonder. Little Mary Jameson had drawn Ghost as a friendly giant guarding a magical kingdom, and her father as a wise wizard who made beautiful things grow in impossible places. "Mary talks about visiting here like other children talk about fairy tales," Mrs. Jameson explained. "She thinks you're the most remarkable man in the world, living up here with your wolf and your gardens that bloom in the mountains." The drawing touched something deep in Jed's heart. Through a child's eyes, Paradise Ridge wasn't the retreat of a broken hermit, but a place of magic and possibility. Perhaps that was closer to the truth than the bitter assessments of his own children. Even taciturn old Henrik Nordstrom made the journey, bringing his accordion and playing mountain ballads on Jed's porch as the sun set behind the peaks. Henrik rarely spoke more than a dozen words to anyone, but his music said everything that needed saying about beauty, loss, and the hope that lived in wild places. Your children, Henrik said during one of his rare conversational moments. They think with their heads, not their hearts. The heart knows what matters. As August faded into September and the aspens began their annual transformation to gold, Jed found himself seeing Paradise Ridge through the eyes of all his visitors. It wasn't just his personal sanctuary anymore. It had become a symbol of what was possible when someone chose courage over comfort. When they built something lasting instead of just consuming what others had created. The photographs Catherine took during this period would become crucial evidence in the court case. Pictures of the terraced gardens, heavy with vegetables, of the workshop where beauty emerged from raw wood, of Ghost and Jed sitting together on the porch that overlooked their shared kingdom. Images that spoke louder than legal arguments about what constituted a life well lived. But even as support gathered around him, Jed couldn't shake the feeling that the most important battle would be fought not in a Denver courtroom, but in his own heart. His children's accusations had reopened old wounds, forced him to confront truths about himself that he'd tried to bury beneath years of mountain solitude. Had he abandoned his family? Or had he simply needed to become a different kind of man than the grief-stricken widower who'd failed his children when they needed him most? The answer would determine not just the outcome of the legal case, but whether Paradise Ridge represented redemption or just an elaborate form of running away. The first hard frost came early that September, painting the meadows silver and turning the aspens to liquid gold. Jed stood on his porch in the pre-dawn darkness, coffee steaming in his hands, watching his breath form clouds in the crystalline air. Ghost emerged from the cabin, stretched luxuriously, and settled beside his companion to watch the sun paint the eastern peaks in shades of rose and amber. This was the time of year Jed loved most at Paradise Ridge, when the world seemed to pause between the abundance of summer and the stark beauty of winter. It was a season of reflection, of taking stock, of preparing for the long months ahead. This year, though, the approaching winter carried an edge of uncertainty that had nothing to do with weather. Catherine's latest letter lay open on the kitchen table inside, its contents troubling enough to cost Jed a night's sleep. The private investigators hired by Sarah and Michael had uncovered details about his wife's death that Jed had hoped would never see the light of day. Margaret had died of consumption, a lingering illness that had stretched over 2 agonizing years. During that time, Jed had indeed withdrawn from his children, spending long hours in his workshop while neighbors and relatives helped care for their dying mother. The investigators had found people willing to testify that Jed had been emotionally unavailable during Margaret's final illness, that he'd left much of the burden of caring for her to his teenage daughter, Sarah. They painted a picture of a man who couldn't face the reality of loss, who'd chosen the refuge of his tools and lumber over the difficult work of supporting his family through their darkest time. The accusations stung because they held more than a grain of truth. Jed remembered those awful months when Margaret's coughing would wake the entire house, when the smell of sickness permeated every room, when each day brought visible evidence of his wife's decline. He'd felt helpless in the face of her illness, unable to build or fix or solve the one problem that mattered most. His workshop had become his sanctuary during those dark months. The only place where he could forget for a few hours that he was losing the woman who'd been his anchor for 23 years. He'd thrown himself into creating beautiful things because he couldn't bear to watch the most beautiful thing in his life slowly fade away. But now his children's lawyers were using that grief-stricken retreat as evidence of a pattern, proof that Jedediah Stroud had always chosen solitude over family responsibility. That his mountain hermitage was just the latest example of a lifelong tendency to run away from difficult emotions. Ghost whined softly, sensing the turmoil in his companion's thoughts. The wolf had an uncanny ability to read human emotions, perhaps developed during his own recovery from trauma. He pressed closer to Jed's leg, offering the wordless comfort that had become one of the foundations of life at Paradise Ridge. They might be right. "Old friend," Jed said quietly, scratching behind the wolf's ears. "Maybe I'm just a man who runs away when things get hard." But even as he spoke the words, Jed knew they weren't entirely true. Yes, he'd withdrawn during Margaret's illness, but he'd also worked extra hours to pay for medicines and doctors, had built special furniture to make her more comfortable, had done everything he knew how to do to fight the disease that was stealing her away. His retreat to the workshop hadn't been about abandoning his family. It had been about preserving his sanity, so he could continue to function when they needed him. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his brooding. A single rider was making the steep climb up to Paradise Ridge, moving with the careful pace of someone unfamiliar with mountain trails. Ghost's ears perked forward, but his relaxed posture suggested no threat. As the rider emerged from the tree line, Jed felt his heart skip a beat. The woman in the saddle was older than he remembered. Her dark hair now streaked with silver, but her posture and the way she held the reins were unmistakably familiar. Sarah, his eldest daughter, the one who'd taken on too much responsibility too young, was climbing toward Paradise Ridge. She dismounted at the edge of the clearing and stood for a long moment, taking in the sight of what her father had built. Her eyes moved from the cabin with its carefully carved details to the terraced gardens, now brown with frost. From the workshop where wood shavings caught the morning light to the man and wolf watching her from the porch. "Hello, Pa," she said, her voice carrying across the space between them with a formality that cut deeper than anger would have. "Sarah," Jed's voice came out rough with emotion. "Didn't expect to see you up here." She approached slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. At 42, she carried herself with the authority of a woman accustomed to managing complex responsibilities, but something in her expression suggested uncertainty beneath the composed exterior. "Beautiful place," she said, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "The stories don't do it justice." Stories. People in Denver talk about Paradise Ridge, about the hermit who lives with wolves and grows flowers in the mountains. Sarah's tone was neutral, giving nothing away about her feelings. "When the lawyers told me you were fighting Thomas's will, I had to see for myself what was worth such a battle." Ghost had been watching the exchange with interest, and now he padded down the steps to investigate this new human. Sarah tensed slightly as the massive wolf approached, but she held her ground, allowing him to sniff her outstretched hand. "He's magnificent," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "I expected something more. Wild." "Ghost chose civilized company over pack life," Jed replied. "Sometimes wounded things heal better together than apart." The words hung in the morning air, heavy with meanings that neither father nor daughter seemed ready to acknowledge directly. Sarah scratched behind Ghost's ears, and the wolf's tail wagged slightly, a sign of acceptance that meant more to Jed than any legal document. "May I come up?" Sarah asked. Jed nodded, gesturing toward the empty chair beside his own. Sarah climbed the steps and settled into the seat, accepting the cup of coffee he poured from the pot that seemed to be perpetually warm on his small porch table. "Why are you here, Sarah?" Jed asked gently. She was quiet for a long time, looking out over the view that had drawn admirers from across the territory. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight of years and unresolved pain. "Because I wanted to understand why you chose this over us," she said. "Why a place I'd never heard of mattered more than the children you raised." "I didn't choose this over you," Jed replied carefully. "I chose this after you made it clear there was no place for me in your lives." "That's not," Sarah started, then stopped herself. She took a sip of coffee, gathering her thoughts. "After Mama died, you disappeared. Not physically, but you stopped being our father. You stopped talking to us, stopped caring about what we needed." The accusation hung between them like morning mist, impossible to ignore, but difficult to address directly. Jed had known this conversation would come eventually, but that didn't make it any easier to navigate. "I was drowning," he said finally. "Your mother was the center of everything for me, and when she died, I didn't know how to be the father you needed. I thought if I could just keep working, keep providing, keep the household running, that would be enough. But it wasn't enough, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. We needed you to grieve with us, not hide from us. The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Jed closed his eyes, remembering the confusion and hurt in his children's faces during those terrible months after Margaret's death. They'd needed a father who could hold them while they cried, who could help them make sense of a world that had suddenly become cruel and uncertain. Instead, they'd gotten a man who retreated into his work whenever emotions threatened to overwhelm him. You're right, he said simply. I failed you then. All three of you. Sarah's admission hung in the morning air like smoke from a distant fire, visible but not yet close enough to burn. She reached into her saddlebags and pulled out a leather portfolio, the kind lawyers used for important documents. Jed's stomach tightened, expecting more legal papers, more evidence of his failures as a father. Instead, Sarah opened the portfolio and withdrew a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The handwriting on the top envelope was unmistakably Thomas's, and the paper was yellowed with age. I found these in Thomas's desk after he died, Sarah said, her voice carefully controlled. They were in a locked drawer, along with some other things our lawyers didn't think were relevant to the will contest. She handed the bundle to Jed, who recognized the ribbon immediately. It was the same blue silk Margaret had used to tie back her hair on their wedding day, a scrap of fabric he'd thought lost decades ago. His hands trembled slightly as he untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. The date was from 6 years ago, and the salutation made his breath catch. Dear Pa, I've been thinking about the last words we spoke, Thomas had written in his careful lawyer's script. I said things that were meant to hurt, and I succeeded better than I intended. Michael and Sarah tell me I was right to cut ties, that you made your choice when you left Pennsylvania. But I can't shake the feeling that we all made choices that day, and maybe none of them were the right ones. Jed's eyes moved down the page, drinking in words he'd never seen before. Thomas wrote about his law practice, about cases that reminded him of his father's sense of justice, about the satisfaction he found in building something meaningful with his hands and mind. He wrote about missing the sound of tools in a workshop, about dreams where he was a boy again, learning to measure twice and cut once. I hired a man to find out what happened to you, the letter continued. He reported back that you'd gone west to the Colorado Territory, that you were living alone in the mountains. Part of me wanted to come find you then, but pride is a family trait, and I inherited my full share. Each letter in the stack told a similar story, a son struggling with regret, wanting to reach out but not knowing how to bridge the gap that years of silence had created. Thomas had written to his father regularly, pouring out his heart in words that were never sent, building a one-sided correspondence that revealed the depth of his longing for reconciliation. Listen to this, Sarah said, opening another letter from the stack. This one's from 3 years ago. I heard from a trapper today who'd been through the Colorado high country. He told stories about a place called Paradise Ridge, about a man and a wolf who'd built something beautiful in the wilderness. I knew it was you before he even mentioned your name. Who else would find a way to make flowers bloom at 10,000 feet? The revelation hit Jed like an avalanche. Thomas had known about Paradise Ridge for years, had been following his father's progress through second-hand stories and travelers' tales. The land purchase hadn't been a sudden impulse. It had been the culmination of years of vicarious pride and carefully hidden love. There are 47 letters here, Sarah continued, her own voice thick with emotion now. 47 letters he wrote to you but never sent. Some are angry, some are sad, but most of them are just lonely. A son missing his father and not knowing how to say so. Jed opened another letter, this one more recent. I'm going to come see you this summer, Pa. I've put it off too long. Let pride and stubbornness keep me from doing what I should have done years ago. I want to see Paradise Ridge with my own eyes, want to meet the wolf everyone talks about, want to tell you that I understand now why you had to leave. We pushed you away with our judgment and our demands that you be someone you weren't ready to be. The words blurred as tears Jed hadn't shed in years filled his eyes. His youngest son had been planning to come home, had been ready to heal the wounds that had festered between them for so long. The knowledge that Thomas had died, still planning reconciliation, was almost more painful than the original estrangement. Why didn't he send them? Jed asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring out over the landscape that had captured Thomas's imagination from a distance. "For the same reason you never wrote to us," she said finally. "Pride, fear. The longer you wait to fix something, the harder it becomes to know where to start." She reached into the portfolio again and pulled out another item, a photograph that made Jed's heart stop. It was the same family picture Catherine had mentioned, the one from the half-built house in Pennsylvania. But this wasn't the original daguerreotype. This was a newer photograph of that old image, carefully reproduced and enlarged. He had copies made, Sarah explained. One for his office, one for his home, and this one, she pointed to an inscription on the back in Thomas's handwriting, for Pa, "When I finally find the courage to come home." The photograph was mounted in a hand-carved wooden frame, the kind of meticulous craftsmanship that Jed himself might have produced. Someone had put considerable time and skill into creating this gift, this tangible bridge between past and present. "Thomas didn't make this frame himself," Sarah said, answering Jed's unspoken question. "He commissioned it from a furniture maker in Denver, a man who specialized in reproducing traditional techniques. Thomas wanted it to be something you would appreciate, something that showed he remembered what you taught him about doing things right." The frame was indeed a masterpiece of traditional joinery, with dovetail corners and hand-cut moldings that spoke of patience and skill. Every detail had been planned and executed with the kind of care that transformed mere function into art. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something the lawyers don't know about. Something that changes everything about this will contest." She reached into the portfolio one final time and withdrew a document that Jed didn't recognize. It was handwritten in Thomas's careful script, but it wasn't a letter. It was a legal document, properly witnessed and notarized, dated just 2 weeks before Thomas's death. "It's a codicil to his will," Sarah explained. "An addition he made after the original document was filed. He never told his regular attorney about it. He had it prepared by a different lawyer, someone who specialized in family law rather than estate planning." Jed's hands shook as he read the document. The language was formal and legal, but the meaning was clear. Thomas had added a provision requiring that any challenge to his will by his siblings would result in the forfeiture of their own inheritance. If Sarah and Michael proceeded with their contest, they would lose everything Thomas had intended to leave them. "He knew," Sarah said, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Somehow, Thomas knew we would try to fight his decision about Paradise Ridge. This codicil was his way of protecting you, of making sure his gift to you couldn't be taken away by our anger and jealousy." The implications of the revelation crashed over Jed like a mountain storm. Sarah and Michael's legal challenge wasn't just doomed to fail. It was actively working against their own interests. Thomas had outmaneuvered them from beyond the grave, using his legal expertise to ensure that Paradise Ridge would remain protected regardless of his siblings' objections. "Does Michael know about this?" Jed asked. Sarah shook her head. "I found it yesterday, hidden in a safety deposit box that Thomas had never mentioned. The lawyers don't know it exists. Michael doesn't know. As far as the court is concerned, we're still fighting the original will." She stood up from her chair and walked to the porch railing, looking out over the view that had inspired Thomas's long-distance devotion. "I came here to understand why you chose this place over us," she said. "But now I think I understand something different. Thomas chose you over us, chose to protect what you built here instead of giving us what we thought we deserved." The revelation reframed everything about the legal battle, but it also raised new questions about Sarah's motives for making the difficult journey to Paradise Ridge. She held the power to end the will contest immediately, to save everyone the pain and expense of a court battle that she now knew they couldn't win. "What are you going to do?" Jed asked. Sarah turned back to face him, her expression unreadable. "I don't know," she said simply. "I came here thinking I knew who you were, what you'd done, what you deserved. Now I'm not sure I know anything at all." Sarah stayed at Paradise Ridge for 3 days, and in that time, the careful walls both father and daughter had built around their hearts began to show cracks. She slept in the small guest room Jed had built into the cabin's loft, a space he'd originally intended for the visitors who never came. Now, for the first time, it served its intended purpose. On her first morning, Sarah woke before dawn and found her father already on the porch, coffee steaming in the mountain air as he watched the sun paint the eastern peaks. She joined him in the comfortable silence that had always existed between them. Even during the difficult years after Margaret's death, "I forgot how much I loved mornings like this," she said, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. "Back in Philadelphia, I never see the sunrise. Too many buildings, too much smoke from the factories." They sat together watching Ghost emerge from his morning hunt, the wolf's grey form materializing from the tree line like a piece of the mountain made manifest. The animal padded up to the porch and settled at Jed's feet, completely at ease with the presence of this new human in his territory. "How did you know he wouldn't hurt me?" Sarah asked, remembering her initial nervousness around the massive predator. "Ghost has good judgment about people," Jed replied. "Better than most humans, actually. He can sense intention, fear, anger, all the things we try to hide from each other." Sarah studied the wolf's intelligent yellow eyes, seeing something there that reminded her of her father's own quiet wisdom. "Is that how you've been living up here? Trusting animal instincts instead of human complications?" "Something like that," Jed admitted. "Animals don't lie about their feelings. They don't hold grudges or nurse old wounds. They deal with what's in front of them and move on." The conversation carried an undercurrent of meaning that neither of them was quite ready to address directly. But Sarah found herself drawn into her father's morning routine, feeding Ghost, checking the gardens for late-season vegetables, examining the workshop where decades of accumulated skill had produced objects of surprising beauty. "You've gotten better," she said, running her hand along the smooth surface of a half-finished table. "I remember your work from when I was young, but this is something else entirely." Jed felt a flush of pride at his daughter's recognition. "Had time to practice," he said simply. "Time to learn from mistakes, to understand the wood instead of just trying to force it into shapes." "Is that what you learned up here? How to work with things instead of against them?" The question cut deeper than Sarah probably intended. Jed set down the chisel he'd been examining and looked at his daughter, really looked at her for the first time in years. She'd grown into a formidable woman, carrying herself with confidence and authority, but something in her eyes spoke of weariness that went beyond simple aging. "What happened to you, Sarah?" he asked gently. "I see success, competence, everything I hoped you'd achieve. But I don't see happiness." His daughter's composure faltered for just a moment, revealing the pain she'd been carrying like a carefully hidden burden. "I built the life I thought I was supposed to want," she said finally. "Married the right man, moved into the right house, became the right kind of woman for Philadelphia society. But somewhere along the way, I forgot to ask myself what I actually wanted." She moved to the workshop window, looking out over the terraced gardens where late-season vegetables still grew despite the early frost. "When Thomas died, when I was going through his papers and found those letters, I realized I'd been living someone else's idea of a proper life. Just like I thought you'd been living some kind of selfish fantasy up here. And now I don't know what's real anymore." Sarah's voice carried a vulnerability that reminded Jed of the young girl who'd once sought his approval for every small accomplishment. "Thomas saw something in this place, something in what you'd built that I couldn't see from a distance. But being here, seeing it myself, I think I'm starting to understand." That afternoon, Sarah helped Jed prepare the cabin for winter, a ritual that had taken on special significance given the uncertainty surrounding Paradise Ridge's future. They chinked gaps between logs with fresh moss and clay, checked the roof for loose shingles, and stacked firewood under the covered porch, where it would stay dry through the long mountain winter. The work was familiar and satisfying, requiring the kind of partnership that Jed and Sarah had shared when she was young and eager to help with household projects. As they worked, memories surfaced, Sarah holding nails while Jed hammered. Sarah learning to read a level, Sarah's pride when her father praised her careful attention to detail. "I was good at this once," she said, stepping back to admire a section of chinking they'd completed together. "Before I decided that working with my hands wasn't ladylike." "You were better than good," Jed replied. "You had instincts for building that your brothers never developed. Michael was strong and Thomas was clever, but you understood structure, balance, how things fit together. The compliment hit its mark in ways that expensive gifts or social recognition never had." Sarah found herself remembering the satisfaction of completing a project, of seeing raw materials transformed into something useful and beautiful through patience and skill. On her second evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Sarah finally broached the subject they'd been dancing around since her arrival. "The codicil changes everything," she said simply. "If I show it to the court, the will contest ends immediately. Michael and I lose our inheritance, and Paradise Ridge becomes yours without question." Jed nodded, having spent considerable time thinking about the implications of Thomas's secret document. "And if you don't show it, then we proceed with the legal battle, knowing we're going to lose anyway. The court will eventually uphold Thomas's will, but not before putting you through months of legal torture and public scrutiny." The choice facing Sarah was more complex than simple legal strategy. Revealing the codicil would end the uncertainty quickly, but it would also mean admitting that she and Michael had been wrong about their father, wrong about Thomas's intentions, wrong about the value of what had been built at Paradise Ridge. "What does your heart tell you to do?" Jed asked. Sarah was quiet for a long time, watching Ghost patrol the edges of the clearing, with the careful attention of a guardian protecting something precious. "My heart tells me that Thomas was smarter than any of us gave him credit for," she said finally. "He found a way to protect what mattered to him, while teaching his siblings a lesson about the cost of anger and pride." "And what about Michael?" "He doesn't know about the codicil yet. Michael is—" Sarah paused, searching for the right words. "Michael is angrier than I am. He sees your retreat to the mountains as the ultimate betrayal, proof that you never cared about the family you left behind. He won't understand why Thomas chose to protect this place over providing for his siblings." Jed felt the weight of his middle son's anger like a physical burden. Michael had always been the most like his father in temperament, stubborn, proud, quick to take offense when he felt wronged. The boy who'd once followed Jed around the workshop with eager questions had grown into a man who saw his father's mountain refuge as evidence of abandonment and selfishness. "Will you tell him about the letters?" Jed asked. "About what Thomas really thought of Paradise Ridge?" "I don't know if it would matter," Sarah admitted. "Michael has built his adult life around the narrative that you failed us as a father. Admitting that might not be entirely true would require him to examine his own choices, his own failures." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of multiple horses on the mountain trail interrupted the evening quiet. Ghost's ears pricked forward, and his posture shifted to alert attention. Through the trees, Jed could see the glint of lanterns. Someone was traveling the dangerous mountain path in near darkness, something no experienced rider would attempt unless the journey was urgent. Who would be foolish enough to climb that trail at night? Sarah asked, concern evident in her voice. Jed's stomach tightened as he recognized the rhythm of the hoofbeats. "Someone who's angry enough not to care about the risks," he said grimly. "That sounds like your brother Michael." The approaching party consisted of 3 riders, Michael in the lead, followed by 2 men Jed didn't recognize. As they emerged into the clearing, the lantern light revealed Michael's face, set in lines of fury that made him look older than his 38 years. The men with him had the hard, practical look of hired professionals, possibly the private investigators who'd been building the case against Jed's character. Michael dismounted and strode toward the porch with the aggressive confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through sheer force of will. His eyes found Sarah sitting beside their father, and his expression darkened further. "So this is where you disappeared to," he said, his voice carrying across the clearing like a whip crack. "I should have known you'd come running to take his side the moment you saw this place." "Michael," Sarah began, but her brother cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Don't, Sarah, don't try to explain why you're sitting here like nothing's changed, like he didn't abandon us when we needed him most." Michael's attention shifted to Jed, and 20 years of accumulated anger burned in his eyes. "Did you think we wouldn't fight for what's rightfully ours? Did you think Thomas's romantic fantasies about mountain hermits would be enough to steal our inheritance?" Jed stood slowly, Ghost moving to flank him as the wolf sensed the hostility radiating from the newcomers. The confrontation he'd been dreading for months was finally here, and there would be no avoiding it this time. "You're welcome here, Michael," Jed said quietly. "But you'll treat your sister with respect, and you'll mind your tone in my home." Michael's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Your home? This isn't a home, it's a hiding place. A monument to selfishness built by a man who couldn't face his responsibilities." The words hung in the mountain air like smoke from a wildfire, carrying the promise of destruction to come. The confrontation erupted like a summer thunderstorm, sudden and violent after days of building pressure. Michael's hired men had fanned out to flank the porch, their hands resting near the weapons they carried with the casual confidence of professionals. But their presence only served to highlight how badly Michael had misunderstood both his father and the situation he was walking into. "Put your dogs on a leash." "Michael," Jed said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd faced down mountain winters and predators far more dangerous than hired muscle. "This is family business, not something that requires witnesses." "Family?" Michael spat the word like it tasted bitter. "You gave up the right to call us family when you disappeared into these mountains and left us to clean up the mess you made." Ghost moved closer to Jed's side, the wolf's yellow eyes fixed on the strangers with an intensity that made the hired men shift nervously. One of them reached for his sidearm, but Sarah's sharp voice cut through the tension. "Stop!" She stood and moved to the porch railing, placing herself between her father and brother. "Michael, tell your men to step back now!" The authority in her voice surprised everyone, including herself. For 20 years, Sarah had played the role of peacemaker in the family, smoothing over conflicts and avoiding confrontations. But standing on her father's porch, surrounded by the evidence of what he'd built from nothing, she found a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "You don't understand what you're doing here," she continued, her gaze moving between Michael and his companions. "This isn't about money or inheritance or legal battles. This is about a family that's been broken for too long." "The family was broken when he abandoned it," Michael replied, but some of the fire had gone out of his voice. Sarah's unexpected defiance had thrown him off balance. "No, Michael, the family was broken when we decided that grief and pride were more important than forgiveness and understanding." Sarah reached into her coat and pulled out the bundle of letters Thomas had written but never sent. "The family was broken when we stopped trying to see each other clearly." She descended the porch steps and approached her brother, holding out the letters. "Thomas left these for us to find. 47 letters he wrote to Pa over the years. Letters full of love and regret and longing for reconciliation." Michael stared at the bundle as if it might bite him. "I don't want to read Thomas's fantasies about our perfect father." "Then don't read them," Sarah said simply. "Stay angry, stay hurt, stay convinced that you're the victim in this story. But understand that you'll be doing it alone, because I'm done carrying anger that's poisoning my life." The words hit Michael like physical blows. His sister's defection was something he hadn't anticipated, a betrayal that cut deeper than any legal maneuvering. In his mind, the 3 siblings had been united in their grievance against their father. Learning that Sarah had switched sides challenged the foundation of his anger. "He failed us," Michael said, but the words came out uncertain now, more plea than accusation. "When Mama died, when we needed him most, he disappeared into his workshop and left us to figure out how to survive on our own." "Yes," Jed said quietly, stepping forward for the first time since the confrontation began. "I failed you, all three of you. I was drowning in my own grief, and I didn't know how to help you swim through yours." The admission seemed to deflate some of Michael's rage. He'd been prepared for denial, for excuses, for the kind of defensive anger that would justify his own fury. He hadn't been prepared for his father to simply acknowledge the truth of his accusations. "But failing you then doesn't mean I stopped loving you," Jed continued. "It doesn't mean I stopped hoping that someday we might find our way back to each other. And it doesn't mean that what I've built here is any less real or valuable because it took me too long to become the man I should have been when you were young." Ghost whined softly, sensing the emotional undercurrents flowing between the humans around him. The wolf's loyalty was to Jed, but his instincts recognized the family bonds that connected these people despite their anger and pain. One of Michael's hired men cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the personal nature of the confrontation. "Mr. Stroud, perhaps we should discuss the legal matters that brought us here." Michael's head snapped toward the man with barely controlled fury. "Shut up! This isn't about you or your legal matters anymore." The hired investigator's face flushed with anger at the dismissal, but he held his tongue. Whatever Michael was paying him, it wasn't enough to get between a family's unresolved grief and rage. "What do you want from me, Michael?" Jed asked. "What would it take for you to believe that I'm not the selfish hermit you think I am?" Michael looked around the clearing, taking in the cabin with its careful craftsmanship, the gardens that spoke of years of patient cultivation, the workshop where beauty emerged from raw materials. For the first time, he seemed to actually see what his father had accomplished, instead of just dismissing it as elaborate avoidance. "I want to understand," he said finally, his voice cracking with emotion he'd been suppressing for years. "I want to understand how you could love this place more than you loved us." Jed looked at his middle son, this angry, successful man who still carried the wounded boy inside him, and felt his heart break all over again. Michael's question revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had poisoned their relationship for 20 years. "I never loved this place more than I loved you," Jed said, his voice thick with emotion. "I built this place because I loved you. Because I needed to become someone worthy of being your father again." The words seemed to hang in the mountain air like morning mist, visible but fragile. Michael's face cycled through emotions: confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been hope struggling against years of carefully cultivated resentment. "That doesn't make sense," Michael said, but the fight was going out of his voice. "If you loved us, you would have stayed. You would have tried to fix what was broken instead of running away." Sarah stepped closer to her brother, still holding Thomas's letters. "Michael, look around you. Really look. Does this look like the work of a man who's running away from anything?" For the first time since arriving at Paradise Ridge, Michael allowed himself to truly see what his father had accomplished. The cabin wasn't just shelter. It was a work of art, every detail considered and crafted with the kind of patience that spoke of deep commitment. The gardens weren't simply functional, they were beautiful, arranged with an eye for color and form that transformed utilitarian vegetable plots into something approaching sculpture. "I came here broken," Jed said quietly. "Broken by your mother's death, broken by my failure to help you children through your grief, broken by the knowledge that I'd let down the people who mattered most to me. I couldn't fix what I'd destroyed, but I thought maybe I could learn to build something good again." Ghost moved between father and son, his presence somehow calming despite his size and wild nature. The wolf looked up at Michael with those intelligent yellow eyes, and something in that gaze seemed to communicate what words couldn't, that healing was possible, That trust could be rebuilt, that broken things sometimes grew stronger in the mended places. 3 years ago, I pulled Ghost out of a trap that would have killed him, Jed continued. He was dying, angry, afraid to trust anything human. But we healed together, learned to depend on each other, built something good from the wreckage of what we'd both lost. Michael knelt slowly and extended his hand toward Ghost, the same instinctive gesture Sarah had made days earlier. The wolf sniffed carefully, then allowed Michael to scratch behind his ears, a sign of acceptance that seemed to break something loose in Michael's chest. I wanted to come back, Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. After the anger wore off, after I'd built my business and proven I could succeed without you, I wanted to come back. But I didn't know how. I didn't know what to say. You didn't have to say anything, Jed replied. You just had to come. The door was always open, Michael. It's still open. Sarah opened the bundle of Thomas's letters and pulled out one specific envelope, different from the others. This one's addressed to you, Michael. Thomas wrote it 6 months before he died. With trembling hands, Michael accepted the letter and opened it. As he read, tears began to flow down his cheeks, tears he'd been holding back for 20 years. Thomas had written about understanding their father's grief, about recognizing that sometimes the bravest thing a man could do was admit he needed to start over. He forgave you, Michael said, looking up at his father. Thomas forgave you years ago, and he understood why you had to leave. Can you forgive me? Jed asked simply. The question hung between them like a bridge that might be crossed or might collapse under the weight of accumulated pain. Michael stood slowly, still holding his brother's letter, and looked around the clearing one more time. I don't know, he said honestly. I want to. I think Thomas would want me to. But I've been angry for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to be anything else. Anger's just grief, wearing a disguise, Jed said gently. I spent 20 years angry at myself for failing your mother, for failing you children, for not being strong enough to hold our family together when it mattered most. But anger doesn't build anything, son. It just tears down. One of Michael's hired men cleared his throat impatiently. Mr. Stroud, we still have legal matters to resolve. The will contest is over, Sarah interrupted, pulling the codicil from her coat. Thomas made sure of that before he died. She handed the document to Michael, watching his face as he read the legal language that would strip him of his inheritance if he continued fighting their father's claim to Paradise Ridge. He protected you, Michael said, looking at his father with new understanding. Even knowing we were going to challenge the will, Thomas found a way to protect what you'd built here. He protected all of us, Jed replied. He made sure this place would survive, but he also made sure his family would have to choose between money and healing. Thomas always was the smartest of my children. Michael folded the codicil carefully and handed it back to Sarah. Then he walked to the porch steps and sat down heavily, like a man who'd been carrying a burden too long and finally found a place to set it down. I need time, he said quietly. I need to think about all of this. Time we have, Jed said, settling beside his son on the steps. Paradise Ridge isn't going anywhere. 6 months later, the spring thaw came early to Paradise Ridge, and with it, changes that Jedediah Stroud could never have imagined. When he first pulled a dying wolf from a steel trap near a crumbling cabin, the sound of hammering echoed across the clearing as Michael worked on the new guest cabin. His movements economical and sure as he fitted timber joints with the precision their father had taught him decades earlier. The younger man had stayed through the winter, claiming he needed time to sort out his business affairs in Pittsburgh before making any permanent decisions. But Jed suspected his middle son was rediscovering something he'd lost in the industrial world, the satisfaction of building something beautiful with his own hands. You're getting that corner joint too tight, Jed called from where he sat on the main cabin's porch. Ghost stretched out beside him in the morning sun. Remember, the wood needs room to move with the seasons. Michael paused and examined his work, then loosened the joint slightly. Still teaching, even when I didn't ask for lessons, he said. But there was affection in his voice, rather than the old anger. The guest cabin was Michael's project. his way of proving to himself that he could contribute something meaningful to Paradise Ridge. It would provide space for the visitors who came now in increasing numbers, people drawn by the stories of what the hermit and his wolf had built in the high country, seekers looking for their own versions of redemption. Sarah arrived as the morning mist was lifting from the valleys below, her horse picking its way carefully up the trail that had become as familiar to her as the streets of Philadelphia. She came once a month now, sometimes staying for weeks at a time, finding in the mountain solitude something her city life couldn't provide. "The apple trees are budding," she announced as she dismounted, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd helped plant those saplings and tended them through their vulnerable early years. "We might actually get fruit this season." The orchard had become Sarah's special project, a symbol of faith in a future none of them could have imagined when the family first began healing its ancient wounds. She'd brought grafts from heritage varieties back east, patient work that wouldn't bear literal fruit for years, but represented something more valuable, the belief that broken things could grow again. Ghost padded over to greet her, accepting the scratch behind his ears that had become their ritual. The wolf had grown grayer over the winter, showing his age in ways that reminded Jed that even the strongest partnerships were temporary gifts. "Any word from Denver?" Jed asked, as Sarah joined him on the porch. "Catherine says the land purchase is finally complete," Sarah replied, settling into the chair that had become hers during these visits. 2,000 acres ridge to ridge with full water rights. Thomas's dream of protecting this place is officially reality. The legal proceedings had taken months to resolve, even after Michael dropped the will contest. But Paradise Ridge was now permanently protected, held in a trust that would preserve it long after Jed was gone. Thomas's final gift to his father had been not just land, but the assurance that what they'd built together would endure. "The Denver papers are calling it the largest private conservation easement in Colorado Territory," Sarah continued. "You're famous, Pa, the hermit who saved a mountain." Jed chuckled at that description. "Wasn't trying to save anything except myself. The mountain was always fine without me," but he understood what the reporters were getting at. Paradise Ridge had become a symbol of something people needed to believe in, proof that starting over was possible, that broken things could be healed, that one person's determination could create beauty in an often ugly world. Michael stepped back from his work and admired the progress he'd made. The guest cabin was taking shape nicely, its lines echoing the main structure, but with improvements born of experience and changing needs. Solar orientation for better light, a more efficient fireplace design, windows positioned to frame the best views of the surrounding peaks. "Think Thomas would approve?" Michael asked, gesturing toward his handiwork. "Thomas would be proud," Jed replied, and meant it. His youngest son's sacrifice had made all of this possible. Not just the legal protection of the land, but the healing of relationships that had seemed beyond repair. As if summoned by the mention of his name, a rider appeared on the trail below, not the kind of casual visitor who occasionally found their way to Paradise Ridge, but someone riding with purpose and familiarity. Catherine Morrison had become a regular visitor over the winter months, drawn not just by legal business but by something deeper. "She's early this month," Sarah observed with a knowing smile. Catherine had been spending more time at Paradise Ridge than her Denver law practice strictly required, helping not just with legal matters, but with the practical work of managing the growing conservation project. There was talk of her relocating permanently to the mountains, establishing a practice that served the scattered communities of the high country, but Jed suspected her interest in Paradise Ridge had as much to do with finding her own version of starting over as it did with legal work. Like so many of their visitors, Catherine was seeking something in the mountains that the civilized world couldn't provide. As evening approached and the family gathered for dinner in the main cabin, a ritual that had become precious to all of them, Jed found himself thinking about the photograph that Thomas had commissioned, the one showing a younger version of himself with 3 small children in front of a half-built house. That family was gone, transformed by loss and time into something different, but perhaps stronger. The children in the photograph had become adults with their own scars and wisdom. The man in the photograph had learned that building something meant more than just putting pieces together. It meant creating space for growth, change, and the kind of love that survived even the deepest wounds. Ghost stretched out by the fireplace, content in the company of the pack he'd chosen over the call of the wild. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and patient, holding their secrets and their promises under stars that had watched countless stories of loss and redemption unfold in the valleys below. Paradise Ridge had become exactly what its name suggested, not perfection, but something close enough to matter. A place where broken things could heal, where families could find their way back to each other, where one man's determination to start over had created room for others to do the same. And in the morning, there would be more work to do, more healing to accomplish, more beauty to build from the raw materials of hope and determination.